Good afternoon. I'm Mike Oren, and I'll be giving a presentation today entitled Dynamite, an Introduction to Active Learning. It's subtitled Passive Learning Presentation on Active Learning. Ironic, isn't it? Here's my outline. I'll be going over what active learning actually is, discussing active versus passive learning, the benefits of active learning. We'll be talking about a software program called DynoVision, which promotes active learning in lecture-style classes. And I'll be talking briefly about active learning and AI. I thought that was interesting as well. So, active learning. This is a definition from Wikipedia. Feel free to read it over. Basically, what this means is that active learning causes the student and the lecturer or the teacher to actually interact in some way, to respond to one another. So it's not just the teacher or lecturer just standing up like I am right now, giving a presentation. The class is asking questions, or we're talking in smaller groups amongst each other and actually actively affecting the presentation, affecting what they're actually learning. So the professor or teacher actually caters to what the students need or want to learn. So this goes into actively thinking. So this means that you don't just absorb the information, you think about the information. Because when you're interacting with the lecturer, you're also interacting with the content. You're interacting with what you're trying to learn. And this gets you to actually think about and analyze it, which gets you to have a richer understanding of the content, which is, in general, a very good thing, because otherwise, I mean, anybody can memorize a book or memorize something and just spit that information out in a test, but what do you actually gain from that? So that's the whole point to active learning. A lot of our presentations in the past have discussed some of this. Lisa's saying on video games. Video games are an active learning strategy because the student actually interacting with the environment, and they're learning to think about it, not just learning the content. So now that moves us on to active versus passive learning. So here on the left side, you have this, the active learning techniques, and on the right side, you have typical passive learning techniques. Critic seminar, that comes from Socrates. He's considered by many to be the first active learning teacher. That's basically where you have a circle of people, circle of students, and a leader of the topic, and the leader kind of just suggests things to discuss, and they all discuss it together, but there's no real teacher. It's more of a discussion-based thing. It's used a lot in literature courses, other humanities like classical studies, where there's not necessarily something that's like the right answer. It's more about trying to find an answer. So philosophy is used a lot into, and my high school English teacher wrote a couple books on the topic as well. So role-playing, and by this I don't mean video game role-playing, I mean role-playing more like in terms of reenacting a historical moment. So I had, in high school again, a history teacher who would have us reenact wars by like rolling up bunches of papers and like throwing them at each other. I mean, it's really silly, but I mean, we had like parts to play too. We were given like historical figures that we'd pretend to be, and I mean, it really helps us know the information a lot better than just hearing the information. It helped us remember like who the important people were. Then group work, that's fairly common. I think you all know what that is. Writing exercises, this can be graded or ungraded. Some people suggest doing the ungraded writing exercises simply because it takes some of the pressure off. But I've only had the graded writing exercises, and a lot of different courses have used that. And that's basically just either in the middle of class or at the beginning of a class, just a brief writing exercise where you explain your thoughts on a particular topic. This is particularly good for people who aren't as vocal in classes, because it gives them an opportunity gives the professor an opportunity to know what it is that they think about a topic when they're not actually vocalizing it in a class, and that will help the professor in the next lecture, after they've had a chance to read all these comments, how to cater the next one. So if there's something that people clearly aren't understanding correctly in the writing exercises, the professor can cater the next lecture to cover that. Guided design, actually I have a separate slide on that I had hidden because I was hoping I'd remember, but since I didn't. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. So guided design. Guided design is reflects several paradigms. It reflects direct instruction by requiring students to read or work on pre-specified content. This basically means that like you could have like a binary tree or something where it's partially completed but not completely completed. And that's kind of like the guide, and then you just kind of insert the pieces into it. And it's a little bit rudimentary, but I mean, it's a good technique for getting involvement within a class. It works a little bit better for like a physics class where you have like an experiment that's partially set up and they just have to finish setting things up. Constant note-taking is and isn't an active learning technique because if you're just copying down everything that's said, then you're not actually thinking about what's being said within the lecture or presentation. So it's a good technique because it's keeping you active, it's keeping you thinking. But at the same time, if you're just copying down everything word for word, then you're going to be losing a lot of the lecture because, I'll get into that a little bit later. So I'll move on to some of the passive techniques. Attending a lecture. Lectures, typically you just sit there, you don't respond to the lecturer, you don't ask them questions. It's a little bit different in business where it's not considered rude to interrupt the speaker. It's done all the time. You don't have to raise your hand. You just ask a question right away. But in academia, it's typically either because of nervousness or whatever else, people don't interrupt the speaker. So that tends to be a little bit more on the passive side because you're just sitting there listening. Viewing a recorded lecture is even worse because then there's nobody to interact with outside of the lecture. Like, if you attend a lecture, you can at least talk to people that were in that class afterwards. But if you're just watching one, you're typically watching it on your own, and there's nobody to interact with. So it's really probably the worst of the passive techniques in terms of getting content out of it. Reading can also be an active technique. It depends how you're reading. If you're reading and annotating, reading and thinking about it, reading and discussing it, then that's fine. But a lot of people, especially if they're reading dense textbooks for like sciences, they tend to just read it and be done with it, and they don't actually get much out of that. Listening again, it depends how you're listening. If you're just listening and absorbing the information, that's a passive learning technique and not very helpful. But if you're listening and responding, so if you're doing dual listening and talking, then that's an active learning technique. And then observing, if you're just sitting around somewhere watching people or watching what's going on, or if you're in a group and you're not participating, you're just watching the group go about their thing, then that's passive. So I covered that. But it is possible to turn passive learning techniques into active learning techniques. I've just got a bunch of list of don'ts here. So don't read, annotate, don't listen, respond, don't observe, discuss, don't lecture, get involved, involve yourself with the students, involve yourself with the class, involve yourself with people you're working with, and don't watch lectures alone. If you're watching a recorded lecture, watch with somebody else and then discuss it as it goes along. So that way you can actually get some of the active learning from the passive stuff. So moving on to benefits of active learning. So the problem with lectures is that typical listening span is a mere 15 minutes. After that, people begin to fall asleep, play games online. I mean, we've all been in lectures. We all know what we do after the first 15 minutes. So on top of that, only 70% of the first 10 minutes can be recalled after the lecture. That's decent, but not too great. And what's even worse is that only 20% of the last 10 minutes is recalled. So that basically means that if you're going to be giving a presentation, you should have your conclusion at the beginning or anything important, because people aren't going to, they're either not going to be paying attention at the end or they're not going to remember it. So you have anything important to say, you should say it quickly. The other thing is that talking speed is 120 to 140 words per minute, but notes are only taken typically at 20 words per minute. Although with computers now, it's a little bit faster, but it's still, they still can't keep up with the speed rate of people talking. So what active learning does is ideally it breaks the speaker-centered lecture into 10 to 15-minute bite-sized pieces. So this means that so I could be talking for 10 to 15 minutes, and then I tell all of you to do like a short writing exercise or discuss things in a group, or we could have like a brief discussion period, which kind of goes on with these smaller lectures now, shorter lectures. In this class, we each do a presentation for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we discuss it. So these are a little bit more on the active learning side. These also, by using active learning, you get something that you can't get well from passive learning. You get a conceptual understanding of the topic. And I've gone over this briefly in a couple of the other slides. Basically, because you're interacting with the material, because you're able to see what it actually happens, or like in the case of the video games, I mean, you can actually see what happens. You can play around with different parameters and understand exactly how it works, as opposed to just being told, this is how it works, which Lisa mentioned in her presentation again, since everybody's going to be referring to hers. And you also, for the speaker, it's also beneficial because you get immediate feedback. You don't have to wait until the very end of the semester when you get your reviews. If you're a professor, you can find out during that lecture how you're doing, and you can improve it that same day or the next lecture. And that way you're not getting a really poor review at the end of the semester. So how PowerPoint fails. I'm using Keynote, which is pretty much the same as PowerPoint for all effective purposes. Computers are interactive objects. PowerPoint is not. Human-computer interaction, I mean, we know about computers being interactive, but because PowerPoint, I mean, it's just one person doing it, it's kind of boring and lame. And I think some of you have probably heard the term death by PowerPoint, where you just have really long, boring PowerPoint slides, and people read directly from the slides. I mean, it's typically an engineering thing. Also, PowerPoint slides are difficult to create in real time. So say I wanted to say something else, or say I hit a slide that I ended up needing. It's kind of difficult to add that slide in if I decide I want it, or to create a new one on the fly. And this can be problematic if you want to do an active learning type of presentation, because if you can't cater to your audience, it's not truly active learning. You're just lecturing, but maybe with some additional interaction. So now we go on to DynoVision, which is a nice solution to the PowerPoint problem. I like it anyway. So it's a commercial application developed at DePauw University. I like to mention that because that's where I did my undergrad. It facilitates interactive lectures. I think you all read the article in my summary about it. Basically, you can create slides on the fly without a problem just by adding a new blank slide, using the pen, writing up whatever you want on it. And everybody sees it on their screens. Everybody can interact with it, write their own notes on it. So it's pretty good like that. It's tablet PC based, which makes it a little bit easier for people who aren't as technologically savvy, can't type as quickly to keep up with things. They can still use the pen. And it also makes it a little bit easier when creating presentations on the fly, because it's a little bit easier to go in and draw a couple doodles than it is to search for files and stuff to insert pictures. It's been used in computer science classes, economics classes, all that other good stuff. So, use of active learning. It uses group work by having people interact with their neighbors to kind of solve it. They can solve a problem together. Guided design, you could again have that binary tree that isn't completed. It could just have like the numbers, and then they'd have to arrange those into a correct binary tree. And that would work for guided design. Writing exercises, they could have a blank panel where they'd have to write some comments about whatever the topic of the day is, and then they can just submit that. There's a submit button, submit panel button, and they can do that, send it to the professor, for the professor to look at later. And there's also constant note-taking, but the key to the constant note-taking is they're not writing down everything the professor says, because a lot of the notes are already on their screen because they get the professor's notes. So what they're constantly taking down in the notes is conceptual understanding information. So things that help them better understand what the topic is, things that the professor just mentions offhand that the professor might not have thought it was important, but because learning strategies differ, the student might find it important. And it also increases attentiveness and enjoyment, as those surveys showed in that paper. So now we go on to active learning and AI. So active learning is not just for humans, particularly useful in natural language processing, where good annotated text may be hard to find. I don't know how many of you have done anything with artificial intelligence before, but I mean, it's a big, complicated field, and it's only getting bigger and more complicated. So anything that can help is always a good thing. And with active learning, machines can construct their own examples. I think it's important to note that they can request certain examples. So that's the interaction part. They're not just going through and learning from the examples that whoever's in charge of the program gives them. They're actually looking for specific examples because they know that their knowledge is lacking in a particular area in order to get the text correctly annotated. So the machine benefits. Active learning has been proven effective according to a study I read anyway. If you want the paper, I've got it linked from the PowerPoint slides. So and the use of active learning for these tasks allow more accurate results to be returned with less direct training. So that means that the researcher doesn't have to find as many examples to give it because it knows which examples or which type of examples it needs instead of just giving it a blind field of stuff and hoping that things turn out right. So that's always a good thing. So active learning is a very useful tool for retention of data. The interactivity of computers has potential to increase active learning in the classroom, and computers also benefit from the use of active learning. Basically, don't listen, respond. None of you have done in this, but that's okay. I said it was a passive learning lecture, so. But yeah, active learning really is a great thing. I mean, I've gone through it throughout high school, throughout my undergrad. I don't know if any of you have personal experience with active learning, but if any of you have questions or comments, feel free to ask those at this time. Eric, you look perplexed. Anything?
I was just thinking about the last thing you said, which was that machines can know what information they need, what questions to ask in order to get the information they need.
Yes, within...
It very rarely knows the right question to ask to take them the next step forward.
That's a good... I mean, I've never... I mean, in the classes I've had, people normally ask questions that tend to lead the discussion forward, tend to lead the understanding of everything forward. So I can't say I've had too much experience with the students not knowing what to ask. I mean, maybe not all students, but there's definitely at least a subset.
I think it's almost a skill, knowing what question to ask. It's the skill of science.
Yeah.
Investigation. You generate a hypothesis, generate a test to see whether or not that hypothesis is correct, and then go out there and get the test is like the question, and then the question brings in information about your hypothesis. So it's almost like you can't just throw active learning at students. You need to teach them how to learn in an active way.
I mean, I think that's true to a point, but at the same time, I think a lot more of it lies on the shoulders of the faculty, of this person giving the lecture, the person giving the presentation or whatever, because it's really hard to interact if the environment isn't there to be interactive with. So.
Oh, yeah, I 100% agree. I was just making the point that there's an additional thing.
Yeah.
Teach active learning style, but we have to support and teach the students how to learn actively.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, because it's a two-way street. That's the problem that's one of the problems with active learning. I mean, you can't just have the students wanting to be taught in an active learning manner if the professor doesn't want to teach that way. And you can't have the professor wanting to teach that way if the students aren't willing to accept it.
So what percentage of us are active?
Well, I am. I don't know.
Well, then obviously many of us in here are, just because
Yeah.
it's self-selected in the section. But what percentage of students, graduates, maybe?
That I didn't see any statistics on. But I mean, because I think Lisa said that in the 1980s, a group of educators got together and said only about 20% benefit from the current learning strategies. And at that time, the current learning strategies were rather passive. I would say even if active learning isn't relevant to everybody, more than likely more than 20%, because it's kind of hard to not get something out of a lecture or presentation or whatever if you're being involved with it. So
I would say it has to do a little bit with how things work in our world. And you mentioned basically the positivism type of approach to knowledge, or scientific knowledge. You know, if there's just one truth, and you're going to be able to observe it if you go through that experiment. But now I think we're moving towards more of a multiple ideas and building our own truths and being more relativistic, rather than having that sole truth standing out there.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we need to go to, because with all the information that is, out there right now, everybody's going to go into knowing more and more about many different things and having their own perspective.
yeah, it's taking a lot from the humanities, where that's been going on for years. Science is typically all about the facts, but now it's becoming more and more about the human factors too, in terms of understanding how different people think and everything else, and how to teach them the different materials and everything else.
Another question: in the study, you mentioned that the students liked it, but I was wondering, was there any mention of like motivation or being engaged in it? Yeah, they're more active, but that doesn't mean they increase their interest in the topic that's being taught.
Well, there was the question about whether or not they were more likely to refer students to a class that was taking Dino, or to take another class in that topic field if Dino was used. So I think to a degree, those questions did kind of suggest that, but you're right, there was no specific question regarding that, or direct findings either, but it can kind of be inferred.
I was also thinking about the issue of intellectual property. As a professor, you're giving that type of class, and a student comes with a bright idea and annotates it. Who has a right to that?
The students' notes are just stored on their own private. Well, it's stored on the server, but it's only a student that gets access to them. Well, and the administrator of the server, but they're not public notes like the professors know. So unless they choose to share them with the professor in the class, because there is an option to submit, or if there's like a quiz or something, the professor can grab the necessary panels from the students. So.
I wonder if there's a trade-off between this active learning and the passive learning, the amount of content that's conveyed. So, like I could see taking electronics in an active or passive way. To do it actively, I might have to build the circuits and to get an understanding for the feeling. And you might argue that you have to get a better understanding for the theory of circuits. But at the same time, I can't cover as much ground in circuit theory. So, did they talk about anything like that, or did you see anything in the literature that
I haven't seen anything about that, but I would say that you're correct in the assumption that you'd be covering less content, just because active learning is a little bit more time-consuming, and especially if you find out that the students aren't particularly picking up on a topic, you might have to do another lecture on that you weren't originally planning. So more than likely it's going to be less content covered, but better understanding of the content. But with better understanding, they'd be more likely to pick up more of the stuff that you didn't cover on their own than they would if you were to just go over large breadths of content and they didn't understand it correctly, then it would be kind of hard for them to pick stuff up on their own later on. So.
You also did mention, though, that was this, I guess this was the beginning, and then you went to Dino. You mentioned breaking it up into 10 to 15-minute lectures, or, you know, sections where you're just listening. That seems passive, and then switching to a little bit of the active learning.
Yeah.
I mean, the Dino system looks like it supports both. It just sort of enhances the note-taking and things, because I've had classes, not exactly with that system, but
yeah, there are similar systems like Class Talk.
The professor had a tablet and like a basic structure for his notes, but then would go through some of them, and you could watch, and he had the pen. And I think that just kind of enhances that. So I don't think that's. I think you can break it up and still cover a good amount of material, but really enhance the learning and how engaged students are.
Yeah.
Maybe a controversial idea. What if this active learning is actually inhibiting our long-term ability to learn independently and on our own? What you're learning in your life on your own. And effectively, our curriculum forces you to do that now. You get a lecture, you have to go back to the textbook and learn it on your own. All our classes become active learning classes. I'm going to need that community to support me in my own learning. Or we might be more inclined to need that to function, to develop. And could that hurt us? There's a lot of places where I have to go and do something on my own, figure it out on my own.
I would think it can hurt us in different ways than passive. Answer some of the parent faults of passive that simply aren't learning because they aren't engaged. So that's obviously a drawback for some people. And I would agree that there probably are some drawbacks for active learning. Specifically, they may not learn those specific things that passive learning forces you to have to do for yourself. I guess it seems to me similar to the video game example, in which potentially you may need to mix these together and see, because people do learn in different ways, different ways that it may just be more beneficial to use them consistently.
Just like we're doing in this class. Passive and active learning.
I think overall, though, it would be more likely to help the student's ability to learn on their own. Because with passive learning, I mean, they'd be reading textbooks, but if they're not annotating the textbooks or anything else, then it's still pretty passive. And with lectures being passive too, they might get some content out of that, but would they necessarily be able to go, without the professor's lectures being there, go and read the book and understand the book properly? I'm not sure. But with active learning, it's all about learning kind of how to learning how to understand things properly. And with the understanding, they should then be able to go off to something that's related but not exactly the same and understand it, while with the lecture and the book, they might just know that particular thing and that's it, and not really be able to connect the dots as well.
When you see the wiki as being
Well, that was one, you made a distinction. You said your lectures were passive learning. And it seems like this class is all about active learning. You have to go out and discover the material that's interesting to you, find something that's interesting, develop it to a point where you can communicate so that the audience understands it. There might not be this back and forth in that lecture style, but it's still an active learning style. The lecture in itself, very narrowly, is not.
Yeah, well, I was just talking about the lecture in and of itself, my particular presentation. So.
But the wiki, so why did you ask that? Because it seems like the wiki is active.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
So you're constructing it's like you're building a mental model of what you're understanding, and other people are kind of sharing in that story, like Wikipedia.
So wouldn't learning on your own be sort of a form of active learning? Because
Exactly.
if it's just you, then say you're engaged in it because you can't do nothing. So I think that I don't think complete dependence, if that ever happens on active learning, is going to keep people from self-instruction. I mean, it is usually just reading and things like that, but if you're doing it on